Hi, everybody. This is Elizabeth Wilson. I'm really excited today to be hosting again our new energy series, our conversations with early career researchers. This is a series that isn't just us at Dartmouth, but a bunch of our other friends and collaborators across other universities, where we come together to try and highlight the really exciting and innovative work of younger scholars. And so today, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Gregg Sparkman, who will be speaking with us on progress on the wicked problem, overcoming behavioral decisions and decision-making hurdles to address climate change and decarbonize society. And the piece that I really appreciate about having Gregg here, we've talked a lot this series about different technologies, different approaches of modeling, different approaches of thinking about policy trade-offs. But focusing today on decision-making will be something that is very, very important. Gregg is a postdoc at the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. And by focusing on social change, including the consequences and norm shifting, he's really getting at an important part of energy system and energy system transition. So with that, I'm going to turn my screen off, invite Gregg to speak. And as always, please feel free to type any questions in the Q&A box below, and we'll have a discussion together in about 20 minutes. Thanks, everybody. And Gregg, thank you so much for being here. We really are looking forward to this talk. Oh, we have 88 people signed up, which is, of course, very fortuitous as well. So wonderful. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. All right, I'm going to share my slides and go ahead and get started. I'm really excited to be here with this audience. I've been a real enthusiastic audience member over the course of the year, hearing many of the talks you've had, and I'm really happy to be able to contribute to this. It's an exciting seminar. I hope this kind of thing keeps going and becomes the norm once, like even post-pandemic, that we get to have these kinds of events and pull people from different disciplines and schools and parts of the world for these kinds of causes. I think that would be wonderful. So today I'm going to be sharing some of my research on what I'm going to call progress on the wicked problem. I'm going to present 2 lines of research specifically, some on how information about norms changing can be helpful in decarbonizing society and different places that could have application value. And then I'm also going to talk about this kind of consistency challenge that climate change presents us, and spillover, which I think is going to be relevant to a lot of the work that people are considering out there. So first, let's talk about why climate change is a formidable psychological problem. So one reason is that it's cognitively complex. Work by Shazina Tari, a colleague of mine, and I think a presenter in this series in the past, have shown is that if you ask people, for instance, like how much different appliances consume energy, you find that they're not necessarily that accurate. So here you might have the actual energy used or saved on one end of a spectrum and what people perceive, and you see there's kind of like flattened curves where they underestimate particularly high level consuming items. So, and this is just one example of how climate change is a complex issue, right? Another one is like we could, people speculate a lot about like which kind of bag am I actually supposed to use at the store. There's all these aspects to climate and sustainability that sort of elude people. And especially if you start thinking about policy, like the average person doesn't necessarily know all the fine grained details about which policies are really going to make the difference on this kind of an issue either. Another reason is that many of the common motivations that we use to kind of propel us through the world are ill-equipped to address a problem like climate change. So self-interest, for instance, does not really suit us particularly well for climate change because self-interest is often thwarted by a variety of contextual factors that are super common in climate change. One is self-interest is usually not as effective in contexts where there's delayed gratification. People don't typically pursue self-interest as well when those benefits are in the future. It's also problematized when benefits are not obvious or tangible, and when the harms are seen as distant or diffuse. These kinds of things sort of elude self-interest motives. Further, self-interest is hamstrung when the kind of problem we're talking about is a collective action problem, because we're asked to undergo personal costs for collective benefits. And we don't really know if other people are going to cooperate and do their part. And if we do something, we chip in, and we put in effort, but other people don't, then we'll be taken advantage of. And no one really likes to be a sucker. You might think, well, then maybe our better angels will be able to help us here. Maybe our motivations like compassion can do something about a problem like climate change. Well, unfortunately, compassion also has a series of things that prevent it from being as effective as we'd like here. One is that compassion is weaker when the suffering that we're considering pertains to people who are of different groups than our own, which is a sad fact, but is a fairly easy to demonstrate phenomenon. Another one is that when the suffering of others is far away, it tends to weigh on us less. Another is that when that suffering is in the future, you get the same kind of an effect. And generally speaking, when the scale of the problem is really big, our compassion tends to collapse. And this is because people want to feel like they can actually make a difference in something. And if they don't, they tend to disengage from that problem and feel less compassion as a result. And climate change is about as big a problem as you could imagine. And so compassion has a difficult time here. Now I'm going to suggest that one possible tool that's well suited for this situation is social norms. So social norms, when we look around, we see everybody behaving the same way, we infer, oh, well, maybe that behavior is competent. Maybe it's important to do this. Maybe it's an enjoyable thing to do. Maybe people are doing it because it's socially approved. All of these things. We essentially say it's got to be the norm for some reason, and we start kind of guessing and estimating around these facts that are essentially giving this behavior benefit of the doubt along a variety of important dimensions. So in this sense, when we see most people behaving the same way or learn that most people have the same attitude about some issue, we undergo this process of self-persuasion as we try to explain that norm status. And we therefore become more likely to conform to norms that we see. So in this sense, social norms are regularly kind of shaping our beliefs about what's true, good, and socially reputable in the world. Coming back to the kind of climate change hurdles that I talked about, social norms are able to help a variety of them. So even though things are cognitively complex, that might be fine as long as people kind of seed the right norm. Then you don't really have to understand how something works. You just have to be able to copy other people and their actions. So you just kind of have to watch and learn in that case. You don't have to understand every little detail about it. What about the motivational front? Well, here we're still okay because norms actually come with their own sources of motivation. People want to be liked, they want to be correct in their judgments, and they want to be good people. But all those things are influenced and defined by social norms. So even though we might not be motivated by this more distant outcome, we have these more proximal social goals that are motivating us to conform. So it's even okay in a context like climate change because we still care about how others think of us and how we think of ourselves, which is influenced by norms. And in particular, collective action problems are especially well regulated by social norms as they're able to enforce cooperation across groups. So they're particularly well suited for those kinds of problems specifically. And this is probably why you see social norms get used in a variety of sustainability and environmental and decarbonizing contexts. So for instance, they've been used in home energy audits to increase participation rates, getting people to compost more, getting people to decrease their demand of home energy and water consumption, getting people to commute in more sustainable ways, and getting people to participate in civic and political actions like voting more commonly. However, there's a major hurdle to using social norms and trying to approach climate change. And that is, in a lot of cases, sustainable actions and like low emitting actions are not the norm, right? So people in the United States live in like high energy consuming homes, and they may be like heating and cooling their homes in ways that are not especially aligned with our climate goals. People often drive alone, people eat meat on a regular basis, and participation in climate protests is not nearly as high as one might hope it would be. So in these kinds of cases, people look around and they go, oh, just about everybody's doing these things. I guess these are competent. I guess these are important things to do. These must be enjoyable. These are socially approved. Essentially what you're seeing is that in these kinds of contexts, norms are maintaining the status quo, right? They're kind of holding us back and keeping people where they're at and not addressing this obvious problem. And I think it goes beyond that. So for a lot of novel climate solutions, you're really asking people to defy norms. So we're asking people to adopt new technologies like electric vehicles. You're asking people to support novel climate policies like rapidly siting renewables and renewable generation like solar and wind all over the place. You might be asking people to shift behaviors and habits that they have, such as starting to participate in these like demand flexibility programs to reduce peak use, for instance. So one question that we have across all these kinds of contexts is, well, how can we actually motivate people to take action when that action is going against the norm? So I examined this question, particularly in the context of meat consumption in my earlier research, and kind of have moved it closer to environment policy later. So I'm going to kind of start with the meat stuff. So I looked at this context because meat consumption in the United States is undeniably the norm. Everyone knows that most people eat meat for most meals. And we know this because we eat meat out in public and we do it with close others. It's generally accepted morally. It's celebrated in holidays. It's like literally the center of the Norman Rockwell painting. You know, it's the case that in pop culture, vegans and vegetarians are often derogated or the butt of jokes. And it's the default on a lot of restaurant menus. So we get these like signals that it's a norm kind of beat over the head many a time a day. However, we also sometimes see information like this, that Americans are eating less meat, that peak meat is animal consumption falling out of style, meat alternatives are on the rise. And this was the case when I was conducting this research, since it seems like meat consumption has kind of climbed back up again. But at the time of doing this, there was often headlines like this that I was seeing. And this made me wonder, could you shift attention away from where the norm is at now and move that attention instead to information about where the norm is going? And could that improve behavior? And this led me to think about the difference between static norm information and dynamic norm information that people might be observing or consuming. So static norm information would reflect where the norm is now. So for instance, in the context of meat consumption, that most people eat meat for most meals. Whereas dynamic norm information is about where the norm is going. So many people are changing and starting to eat less meat might be a dynamic norm observation or a piece of information you could hear or a message. And my thought was shifting our attention away from where the norm is now and to where the norm is going might be able to recruit these conformity processes to actually motivate further change rather than just reinforce the status quo as it is now. And so we set out to do that. I'm going to talk about one study where we showed this. So what we did is we went to a cafe that had a reasonably long line, and we offered people $5 off lunch that day if they'd participate in a survey for us. In that survey, they either read a static norm that some Americans make an effort to eat less meat, or a dynamic norm that over the last 5 years, some Americans have changed and started to make an effort to eat less meat, i.e. that this number was growing over time. Or we gave them a control group about a dynamic norm that was irrelevant, that some Americans are starting to change, but about something else not related to meat, which was they were using Facebook less. We asked people why they thought this was going on. And then as a thank you, we said, great, here's your coupon for $5 off of lunch. And we were kind of situated such that they would have to then hand us back the tablet they were working on, and then they'd kind of round the corner. And then they go to where the front of the line was, where we actually couldn't directly see them. But unbeknownst to them, on this coupon, there's a coupon code. And we used that to kind of identify which condition people had been in, and to reimburse the cafe. At the end of the day, we would staple copies of their receipt to their coupons so that we could see who bought what and actually tally up what people ordered. And so we coded whether people got meat or not. And what we found is that in the control group, about 20% of people were getting a vegetarian dish. In the static norm, it's about the same, about 17% of people. And these two really shouldn't differ that much, because in the control group, you're surrounded by people, most of whom are eating meat at that cafe. In the static norm, you're reminded that some people make an effort to eat less meat, but it's not most people. And so you're kind of given very similar information, right? That only a minority of people are doing this other thing. But in the dynamic norm, you're learning about this change over time. We've shifted your attention away from where things are to where things are going. And in that scenario, we see this dramatic boost from about 17 to 34% of people getting a meatless lunch that day, or from 1 in 6 to 1 in 3 people, from comparing the static norm and the dynamic norm. So it does seem like drawing attention to change in a norm over time can lead people to become more motivated to do these counternormative behaviors that are increasing. So one question you might have is, okay, this is a nice kind of demonstration. Can you scale this kind of thing up? And so what we did is we collaborated with restaurants on something called the Dynamic Norm Menu Project. We actually wove dynamic norm statements into menus themselves, putting the information at the point of decision making. And we analyzed this for over 100,000 restaurant dishes that were ordered over the course of about a year and a half. And what we found is that, yeah, you can actually get a measurable effect from this kind of thing. And we would kind of randomize which days these signs would be on the menu, which days they weren't, and observe effects that way. Another question you might have is, can you have a lasting effect from this kind of an intervention? And yeah, we did one where we had like these op-eds that really elaborated the content and tried to scaffold it onto people's values and goals, corresponding with how society was changing. And we saw from that kind of a manipulation that we were able to observe effects for about 5 months out. And that's as far as we measured, so they might have kept going. We just don't know. And then, of course, I think for this audience, perhaps the most relevant question is, okay, can you see similar effects for other climate-related contexts? And the answer is yes, we see it for a variety of contexts. So for instance, we saw it for water conservation. In one study that we ran, we saw that information that there was a growing majority of people conserving water was about 3 times as effective as just learning that there was a majority, but not necessarily a growing one, that conserved water. Others have shown that this also impacts reduced use of disposables, for instance, contexts like that. And in another project that is currently under review, that I've done with a few collaborators, we've seen that if you portray information that like a growing number of Americans are becoming upset and angry about climate inaction, that this can lead to increased levels of policy support for things like a carbon tax. So we see this kind of effect, it seems to be quite broad. And in fact, outside of the environmental context, I've used it in other spaces as well, such as health decisions and other policy areas too. And we see a variety of effects across these variety of areas. So some possible applications that I think will be relevant to this group. One is that you could really speed up the adoption of novel technologies. This is sort of the ideal space to use this kind of a thing. So whenever you have, right, this rapid acceleration of people starting to do something, that is exactly the time to hop on and layer on this messaging that more and more people are doing this. Many people are changing in this case, as suggested here, that the EV share is going up as a percentage. More people are switching away from gas and diesel vehicles to electric ones, for instance. This can also be used to hasten state mandates for renewable energy. You could advertise that more and more states are adopting aggressive policies. And you might be able to use this to create surges of climate policy support by emphasizing that over time, more people are becoming more concerned, right, about climate change. And the number of people who express like disengagement, doubt, or dismissiveness, generally speaking, are shrinking relative to the number of people who are alarmed, concerned, or at least cautious. So some takeaways from this line of work is that social influence isn't a force that always reinforces the status quo. In fact, it can be used to help animate movements to overturn that status quo. And I think this is going to be applicable because many norms that go against decarbonized society, many norms go against decarbonized society, but sometimes, and in many cases like the ones I showed, those things are improving over time. So you can highlight that improvement rather than focusing on the fact that we're doing so bad right now. And that could be very helpful. Further, I think this shows that adoption curves aren't fixed, right? They can actually be sped up when needed by emphasizing this kind of information. And I think this also provides us with some hope that even in cases where the norms aren't good now, but a small group of dedicated people can actually create change if they kind of shift attention to this is the direction things might be going. Now I want to shift gears and talk about a second line of work. This one I'm going to refer to as a kind of consistency challenge of climate change, which is a little bit different from the basic motivational challenge. And this is because climate change asks us to change across a variety of contexts in our lives. For instance, it might ask us to change our transportation behavior. We might feel it asks us to change our dietary behavior. People might feel like it's asking them to change how they use energy in their home. People might feel like it asks them how to change their waste and waste sorting. People might feel like it asks them to change their consumer behavior. People might feel like it asks them to change how they spend their leisure time and get more involved in policy, familiarize themselves more with environmental policy, or take political action. So people essentially might feel like climate change is a hard problem because it's asking us to make many changes day after day consistently for our lives. So in that kind of a respect, how can we motivate people to take consistent action? In particular, I'm going to focus on this question in the context of sustainable lifestyle choices, so behavioral choices, and policy choices, so policy support. This, of course, is very important because as many of us are familiar, the IPCC has shown that under different pathways of sustainability, that with the current technologies we have, we really are going to have to rely on reductions in demand, both from behavior and policy changes in order to meet our climate goals. But others have posed that these things are actually antithetical, and there is sort of a way that behavior is opposed to policy. For instance, some have said that really people who used to just deny climate change have shifted tactics, and now they're just trying to deflect away attention from policy solutions and towards individual lifestyle choices. Others have said that neoliberalism essentially has just conned us into defining climate change as individuals rather than taking on corporate interests. People have gone so far as to say your carbon footprint is just meaningless. This is a case of distraction versus action. And other people, of course, going further, just say like people just need to shut the hell up about plastic pollution. Enough of these topics. None of these things matter. There's only one thing that matters. So a lot of these kind of exhibit this kind of zero-sum belief, right? That we have like limited time and effort and attention, and so any and all these things are going to be a problem. If they're moving our attention away from what really matters, transformative climate policy. These arguments usually go that individual action is a small part of the puzzle at best and a major distraction from actual systematic change at worst. But to me, as a social scientist, this is an empirical question. Do sustainable behaviors actually dissuade people from supporting climate policy? i.e., do you see negative spillover such that engaging in sustainable behavior is somehow going to limit how much people are going to support climate policies? Well, first we can look at the correlational data. And here what we see is that many of the people who act sustainably are more likely later on to support climate policies and take political action. And this is true even if you control for how much political action and political support they had for climate change at time one, meaning like it seems to be its own unique contributor to how much people are going to be likely to participate in political action later. But the experimental evidence gives us some cause for concern. One study found that household behavior can actually crowd out climate change policy support. In this study, what they did is they took participants, in this case a sample in Japan, and they randomized them to do a checklist of which energy-saving behaviors they did, and then they asked them how much they supported an increase in the carbon tax, and they found that it actually led to less support. Specifically, they find that in a control group, there might be around 33%, and that this kind of dropped down a bit, closer maybe to 30%, when they had people reflect on how many sustainable behaviors they did, ask them to either check 3 of the things they did or 10 of the things they did. So should we always expect negative spillover from sustainable behavior to climate policy? Or under what circumstances might this be true or not true? And is it possible to instead evoke positive spillover such that sustainable behavior leads to even greater policy support? So to answer this, let's take a step back and first ask, well, what leads to positive and negative spillover in the first place? So some research has looked at some motivational factors that lead us to be consistent. One of them is this idea of self-perception theory, that our own attitudes towards every particular topic are a bit hazy. And so we actually will reflect on our own behavior in order to infer our attitudes. So if someone goes, do you like bread? I think, well, I eat bread pretty often, so I guess I must. So we basically use our behavior as a source of information to infer our attitudes when we're uncertain about them. A similar theory is cognitive dissonance, which is that people don't like having inconsistencies. They don't want to say, I really love this, but I never do it. Or I always do this, but I say that I hate it. And when that happens, people are going to feel aversive and they'll be motivated to change one of those things to become in greater alignment. So these kind of motivate us towards some kind of consistency usually. However, there's motivations that lead us to be inconsistent, such as moral licensing. One version of this, known as moral accounting, is the idea that people have this kind of baseline standard for how good of a person they want to be. And they do a good deed and they feel pretty good about themselves relative to that standard. And they actually feel what we're going to call morally licensed. And then they feel entitled, in fact, to slack off a bit. And they might do a bad deed. Then they feel kind of bad. And then they do some kind of moral compensating action to feel better than their standard. And they kind of just keep hopping up and down on this jigsaw-like pattern. There's also a very similar idea known as single action bias, which is that we might feel bad about something, but we do one action and suddenly we feel fine about it. We don't feel like we need to take even more actions beyond that to address the problem. Breaking down what leads to these factors, like what leads us to go down consistency or licensing paths. One review finds that when people reflect on things with greater abstract construal, like a high level reflection, like why do I do this behavior? These kinds of abstract questions, the more likely they get consistency. Whereas if they just reflect concretely, what do I do? What did I do? You get licensing. People find that when you have greater identification with the behavior, you'll get consistency. But when people don't really identify with the behavior at all, doesn't relate to their sense of self, you get licensing. When people reflect on their values in conjunction with that behavior, they're more likely to get consistency. When they don't do this kind of reflection, more likely to get licensing. When people frame that prior act as like, I did this because I'm so committed to this, they're more likely to get consistency. When people say, oh, I've done this, I've already made so much progress, then people might feel entitled to rest on their laurels. You might get licensing. And another review, specifically looking just at environmental behaviors, finds that there's also this rule and role-based decision-making, which is the idea that people evoke their sense of like, how do I think society ought to be? And what role do I have in society and amongst close others that I care about? When people think about things that way, they get more consistency over time. But if they're just instead making these affective-based decisions, such as I feel really guilty about this, I want to do something to remedy that guilt, then you're more likely to get licensing later on. They additionally find that when subsequent actions feel more costly, then you're probably going to get licensing too. So what should we suspect in the context of sustainable behavior and a carbon tax? Well, it seems like how people reflect on the action should matter. If they reflect really concretely, that's likely to hurt. That's basically what Werfel's study, I think, shows. Like they just do this checklist task, which is about as concrete as you could imagine. But internalizing these actions might help. For instance, people connect them to values, identities, or their societal outlooks. That could actually perhaps produce positive spillover instead. And how the policy is framed might matter as well. So for instance, if that policy is seen as having a high personal cost, you might feel like it's unfair. Like you already conserve energy and now you're being asked to pay more on your utility bill because there's some new law that got passed. That might feel unfair to people, like they're being punished for doing a good deed. Whereas if the policy feels like it has a lower personal cost, that might avoid these feelings of unfairness. For instance, if that policy is framed as instead being focused primarily on industry, as in like who is actually getting charge money from it. And of course, if the policy itself doesn't have direct fiduciary costs, right, then you might suspect that this is going to perhaps negate these feelings of unfairness. So we wanted to test out some of these ideas. We recruited a sample of states that have that are part of the PGM interconnection, and we also wanted to know about their support for a state-level carbon tax. So we recruited 500 participants per condition with 6 conditions for 3,000 folks using online sampling through MTurk. And what we did is we randomized people into this 3x2 experimental design. So there was 3 reflection conditions. One of them was that you just don't reflect on your behaviors at all. One is that you do a very similar checkbox task like the one that Werfel had in their study. And the third is that you reflected, but then you also, by doing the same checklist task, but then you also internalized it we just added a single question, which is to explain why you do these behaviors in terms of your values and who you are. And then people reviewed a carbon tax. And we either framed that as having costs fall on the individual or on industry. So the individual one, for instance, it emphasized that if individuals don't reduce, they're going to have to pay more for the carbon dioxide emitted. Whereas the industry one emphasized which industries are being charged, and then said if industries don't reduce, they're going to have to pay more. Then they rated each of these policies for their degree of support, and we assessed other policy attitudes as well. And here's what we found. So when the policy is framed as having costs fall on the individual, we're able to replicate that Whirlpool effect, such that if people only reflect in this kind of concrete manner, their support for that policy drops down a bit. But however, this goes away when people internalize that action. They're asked, like, why do you do this? Now we're no longer seeing that effect anymore. In fact, it starts to drift upwards a little bit, although it's not significant here compared to the control. The industry framing of the policy, generally speaking, much more popular. People love it if you're talking about the carbon taxes, like we're gonna make people in industry pay who emit. People like that kind of framing a lot more, and generally you're not seeing much of an impact based off any kind of reflection condition when that's the case. Looking at how people felt like this policy might seem unfair because they already do many things to conserve resources, we find that just reflecting on its own leads the individual level policy to feel more unfair, right? But this goes down significantly once people internalize, although it's still higher than the control group. And we see over here, there's like more muted differences in the industry condition, though perhaps some increase when people reflect still. What about other kinds of policies, such as those without direct financial costs? So we asked people about their willingness to have high efficiency power lines sited near them, such that they'd be visible from their home. We asked how willing they would be to have these kinds of things sited with that kind of visibility. And we explained that they're good for energy efficiency, but there's these big towers going to be close to you. How willing would you be to have that? And for something without these direct fiduciary costs, we don't see any detriment from this kind of concrete reflection. In fact, we don't see any differences by reflection at all. We also just ask people outright, how do you think we're going to address climate change? Do you think we need policies? Do you think we need personal behaviors? Do you think we need personal behaviors and policies? Do you think we need neither of these things? So when people are reflecting on behaviors, are they generally saying we don't need policy anymore? Generally speaking, we find that the vast majority of people are selecting that they think we're going to need both. And we find no differences across their selection of that by condition here. So just to recap these results, we're able to replicate that negative spillover result that Werfel found, but we find 3 major boundary conditions where that spillover goes away. So one is that people ask to reflect on why they do that behavior. You no longer get negative spillover. When the cost or framed is falling on others who should also contribute, such as industry, you no longer get that negative spillover. And when that action is perceived as less costly, such as a policy or a willingness to have visible transmission lines be near one's home, you're not going to see that negative spillover. But of course, the question I want to know is, like, can we actually get positive spillover out of this too, right? It'd be better if we could get these things not just to not harm each other, but instead to kind of amplify each other. And for that, I think we're going to have to improve our internalization tasks, because when I looked back at it, what I noticed was that participants in our survey gave extremely brief answers, and essentially nobody mentioned anything related to identity, even though we kind of asked them to say something about that. Also, we noticed that some participants referenced saving money. And if you were just being consistent with saying, I like to save money, and then go, okay, do you support this policy that might cost you more money? The consistent thing to do would be to say no. So we did a revised version of this task. We asked people, first we said, like, we understand people might be doing these things to save money. We're also kind of curious what other reasons people might have for doing them. And then we kind of made them articulate these ideas more thoroughly by breaking this down to 3 questions. How does this correspond to values? How does this relate to identities? We even hear modeled statements of identity statements because people don't know how to make identity statements very easily. So I'm a blank kind of a person, for instance. And then we also asked how it relates to their societal outlook. Like, how does this relate to how you think society should be? We repeated a very similar design to the first study, where people were randomized to 3 reflection conditions where they did not reflect, or they reflected with the same 12 behaviors, or there was this new and improved internalization task tacked onto that reflection task. And we only looked at the individual policy from study 1 because that's one where we saw negative spillover. And here's what we found. So now we actually weren't able to replicate the reflect only effect here. So we didn't actually see negative spillover even in the worst case scenario this time around, although it is trending in that direction. But we did see a significant boost under the reflect and internalize condition. And that is compared to the control. So we actually do see positive spillover now when people internalize in this slightly more elaborated fashion. One question you might have is, okay, but how big are these effects really? Well, one way to answer that is to kind of dichotomize people into either supporting or opposing this policy. What we find is that a slight minority here are opposing it under the control group. And this goes up about 6% compared to the control group when they internalize. And just to kind of benchmark that, you might remember there was the Washington State carbon tax that failed, and it failed by around 6%. So this is sort of the margin that you would really like to see flip if you could. So what accounts for positive spillover in these contexts? So we see that the general effect is partially mediated by having people feel like this reflects their values more, that this is consistent with who they are, and that this policy reflects their worldviews. But again, this is mediational analysis, so it's all correlational, and it's not a super strong mediation. So as I would say, just sort of partial evidence of this phenomena as being what's carrying it. We also can look at people's differences according to how many actions they did, right? So people could check as many as they did. So people who, for instance, said they do more actions, you see a general uptick in how much they support the carbon tax. But this uptick is much greater when they reflect and internalize than if they just reflect on their own. So you're seeing an even bigger punch for those who say, I do many things, and then they internalize, they have even stronger support. Conversely, if you look at if this policy feels unfair, you see that in the reflect only condition, the more things you do, you start feeling like, hey, I already do a lot. But if people internalize, that actually flips around and goes the other direction where you go, no, that's not unfair. So just to recap, negative spillover may only occur under very precise circumstances where people don't connect their actions to why they do those actions. When there's large financial policy costs associated with it, and those costs is framed as falling on the individual. But positive spillover occurs when people internalize their actions by, over time, connecting them to values, identities, or societal outlooks. And based on the correlational data that's out there, it seems like this might be normally how things go, that things that we do early in our lives, we sort of eventually kind of take them in as things that we care about. So based on this, I would say there's no broad reason to really shy away from behavior change campaigns. Behavior and policy support need not be substitutes. We shouldn't necessarily think about them in a zero-sum kind of fashion. In fact, many people already see them as complements, it seems. But behavior change campaigns really should make an effort to help people internalize actions. I mean, why leave this to chance? You might as well push people towards internalizing when you can. So for instance, someone might ask, well, how should you label a campaign then? Let's say you want to encourage people to take sustainable transit or to have solar panels on their roof or eat a vegetarian diet, whatever it is. Like, what should you be doing? What should that banner look like? A lot of times you'll see banners that might look like this, do this, and it'll fix climate change. This would be a terrible banner based off of the data I just shared with you and the theory that I shared with you, because it's really emphasizing that you've already made progress. There's no mapping onto values, anything like that. Instead, I suggest that we have this kind of broader banner that says we do this as part of a broader effort to signal our commitment to decarbonizing society. That's why we're doing all of these things. That's what it's about. And you might as well make room and say, this includes the political actions that we care about, right? So we need people to vote, we need people to participate politically, and we want people to change behavior, right? So this is all one sort of broad banner across the board. I want to say thank you to my collaborators, and I'm excited for the questions and answers. Well, hopefully you're excited for the answers.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was just a super talk and really, really interesting. I think given both the other talks in this series, I think you bring up some issues that are absolutely important. And also for all of us as individuals and as people engaged in these really tricky, you call them wicked, that's a very New England term, problems. I appreciated as well that a lot of the conventional wisdom framing is, if it's the least cost solution and we optimize this, people will do it. Although all empirical evidence points other directions. And I just, from your perspective, and I know you're in a shop where lots of people do those types of analyses, how do you engage with kind of that thinking of least cost solutions will rule the day when so much of the work that you wrestle with highlights a lot more complexity in terms of how people think about things, in terms of how people actually change and actually make decisions? Yeah,
when you say least cost solutions, you mean
a beautiful sort of really optimized energy model that gives us the 10 technologies we're all going to have built in 2053.
Mm-hmm. And do you also mean like the single determining factor in those models is like cost for people? Like that's how things are working?
Cost and maybe performance of my energy technology X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. I've had sometimes I've like sort of shared work before and people have been like, don't we just need to make things more convenient? Like they kind of come back and like want to boil it down. And I'm like, yeah, well, there's a lot of things we do in life that aren't convenient. Like we have kids, not especially convenient, but we seem really motivated to do it. And so I would say that, there's a broader spectrum of motivations that animate people to take action. And some of the actions we put the most effort into, we don't do them because they're easy, right? We do them because we care tremendously about them. And so there's like multiple levers for people to consider. And I think that it's not to say that it's not good to make things cheaper and more efficient and take advantage of these more obvious factors. It's just saying that people's two things. One is those aren't your only tools. And so I don't know why you limit yourself to that. And the other is that people's perceptions of if something's worth the cost and if convenience is really that valuable in this context are really shaped by a lot of the factors we're talking about too, right? So if something is convenient to begin with is subject to perceptions of norms, and like whether something is a good value or not is subject to if you see other people seeming to do it and it seems to make sense to them, right? So like when people are grappling with like, should I get home solar or rooftop solar? And it's a pretty elaborate calculus. You're like, well, here's how much they might diminish over time. Here's the value. If you bought them later, maybe it'd be cheaper. You know what I mean? Like you might sell your home. Like there's like all these things, like how long are they really going to last? Am I going to have to fix them later? At what point, right? So you can try to run through all of that, but if other people are doing it and it seems to be working for them, that's like going to be your heuristic, right? And that's how most people act under complex scenarios. And climate change certainly is a complex scenario. So we're going to rely on those heuristics, even when we're trying to determine things like, is this actually cost efficient? Is this convenient? We're going to look at norms as a source of information to figure those things out. So like
and I remember,
EV is a good example
a few weeks
of that.
ago with Cale Reeves, he had a lot on kind of the PV adoption. And for me, it seemed that we almost need more biological contagion models, right? To see how they spread in different neighborhoods because of that importance of proximity for actual decision-making, which is what you're saying in terms of social norms.
Yeah, another good example to think about this is we're living through one right now with the pandemic, right? There's a lot of people who are opposed to getting a vaccine that will save their lives. This should give us pause in thinking that people are rational actors who are only motivated by money and convenience, right? Like people are willing to die for this. What is that? What does that mean? Right? And we know that they're getting information through a lens of particular norms of actors they trust, right? And so that should be a pretty easy demonstration of like, there's a couple other things you need to think about that are going to actually interact with the factors that we're already modeling and like kind of turn them on or off almost depending on how they go.
We're getting a few questions in the Q&A. I want to invite all the audience members. Please feel free to type your box in. I'm going to ask one more and then go forward. One of the pieces in the energy literature that we don't do as much, but it's very common in water literature is social shaming. And I appreciated your social norms conversations, but I also recognize that, anytime there's a water shortage, having grown up in the West, they'll have a list of, the 10 highest users and those people will be called out. How do you think about that type of action within a social norms and behavior context?
That's a great question. The sort of sticks side of social influence, right? The like threats to reputation are only going to be viable when you have two things. Yeah, when you have two things in your favor, and those are you want the majority of people to already be doing that thing in order to use that kind of negative
So you're getting on
sanctioning.
that fairness thing a little bit then.
Sort of. It's basically like, let's say that so in the context of a drought in California where like certain
Mm-hmm.
communities no longer can have well water and need to have water trucked in, like people totally understand this is a problem, they buy it, they get that it's a huge deal, and when they see someone waste water they get furious. Like that is how most
Yeah.
people feel, right?
Yeah.
And so in that case shaming's great. But if it's a case where you're trying to, let's say you try that in the meat consumption context though, right? And
Very different. Yeah.
you tell people like, hey, look at all these people who eat way too much meat. Like you're not going to get the same effect at all because it doesn't have the static norm level is not high enough, right? It's
Okay.
you can't lean back on where the norm is because it's not behind you. And instead, what's going to happen is you're going to get reactance. People feel entitled to choose these things, and they're going to act in ways to reestablish that freedom when threatened. Even when they're not threatened, they're going to react that way sometimes, as we've seen from the recent conservative response to being like, they're telling us we're going to have to eat less meat, and that didn't actually get said, right? So people are going to be motivated when a majority of their camp doesn't accept that basic premise that that's like a value. So most of the things that I'm talking about are contexts where you're trying to persuade people to do something new. And so
Mm-hmm.
we usually
Mm-hmm.
use the carrots side of social influence. We actually emphasize like it's not like most people are starting to do this and you should too. We usually don't use that language. Instead, it's many people are starting to do this, you can join in. So we change it from a request to an invitation.
And that idea of the dynamic component was interesting too, of thinking about that this is a movement that is, the world is blowing this way, you can be part of this as well, was I thought an
Yeah.
interesting piece I hadn't thought about. Luca Mastro Pasqua says, hi Greg, great concepts, completely agree that focusing on the positive effects of change helps motivation compared to indulging only on the negative status. And I think a lot of us who work in this field are very guilty of that, where we start all our talks with, pictures of flooded cities or burning fires. And so I'm just wondering from your perspective, how do you take this kind of deep need for both mitigation, but also adaptation and use a positive story going forward?
I think that part of this kind of gets back to related literatures on sort of the like preferred motivational state and sort of flavors of motivation from
Mm-hmm,
emotions
mm-hmm.
that you want to use, right? And I think that it's okay to have some part of doom and gloom in your message, so long as you offer clear, efficacious ways forward at the end that people like really buy and perceive to be good solutions to those things. And they feel like if I did it, it would really help this thing. But if you don't think you can actually persuade people they will somehow solve this problem by taking action, right? Or if they feel like still overwhelmed by the negative, that's not usually not that effective. And based off of the spillover literature, it's also going to maybe make them take action once and then kind of feel better and then not do anything more.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
if you want a more sustained source of motivation, I think focusing on the positives is going to get you a bit further, and having people internalize them as part of their values and identities and view for how society ought to be is going to get you a lot farther in the long haul. That's a
No,
long-term project, though. It's hard.
yeah, and what I appreciate from like an energy system transformation, or while simultaneously dealing with the needs for adaptation in a shifting climate and agricultural systems and communication systems, that this is a really big ticket. It really is not just change in one area. I mean, we're talking about climate, but really we're also talking about adapting our human living systems to a world that none of them have been designed for.
Right. And I think that some people might say like, oh, do we have time to like even afford asking these questions of shifting people's identities and values and things like that? And I think that people might be surprised how quick that can happen and how much ground has already been covered,
Right.
would be my 2 cents. Like one, you can kind of already see like kids who grew up learning about climate change as part of their regular education are already like, wait, the world's ending, we're not doing anything about it. And they like take it at face value that that's the case. And they're going out and they're protesting and they're like some of the most stringent supporters, and they're forcing the conversation at the national level. Like they are
And at the
succeeding.
university level and in their communities, they're holding all of our feet to the fire.
Right. So that's like, it doesn't hurt to have this part
Yeah.
as part of your
Yeah.
solution set. It complements whatever policy or other thing that you want to see happen, probably, because it's going to give you more fuel in that system to bring attention to this and keep it in the public eye and maintain pressure on folks. I think that the other thing too is that you don't have to have people who be like diehard environmentalists. In our state, that's not what most people are. Instead, people have really relatable values that are really common. Like, I don't like to be wasteful, right? Like very few people disagree with that. And that is already a foothold. And so I think getting people to scaffold that onto climate and other issues is going to be enough to help move the needle on some of these things.
No, that's interesting. Next question, Kyle Spencer. In reference to the negative correlation between sustainable lifestyle choices and support for sustainable policy, my mind immediately went to proper education. Do you think those who are changing their lifestyle are educated enough about why they are doing so? Is that what they will do to better understand sustainability initiatives as a whole and therefore become more likely to support sustainable policy change?
Yeah, I think in the correlational...
And again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A box for this. So Ron, I see that you are raising your hand, but please type your question in the Q&A box. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think that in the correlational data that I referenced, right, there's going to be all kinds of individual level factors. Education could be one, like how your parents feel and act could be another, right? The kind of town you live in, right, that's going to expose you to more ideas, or maybe even have a rally about this issue versus the town that doesn't. Like there's all these kinds of factors going on. It does sort of paint a general picture, though. It seems like on average, this is what's happening, that people who are in these kinds of spaces and are engaging in actions at time one are more likely to continue down that path at time two, right? And go beyond their current levels. Like that's even controlling for their political action at time one. So it does seem like there's a causal aspect from that data, but our data is experimental. And so now we're leveling all of that through randomization and then asking, okay, now can we see, just like getting people just to internalize just in the brief moment of our experiment, which is like kind of a to do, right? Because normally people internalize over the course of months, presumably. But we're getting them to make connections just in like the 5-minute window of the study. And we're able to kind of show that this effect happens on that kind of a small scale. So I think normally education plays a big role in terms of getting people to make those connections and do both of those things. It should be no shock, right, that those things correlate generally. And I'm certain education plays a role in that.
We had a series or a conference last week on investing in our energy futures. And I have a question here from John Jeffers asking, are there parallels in investor psychology which could affect how financial actors, investors shift norms?
That's a great question. Some of my colleagues in the behavioral science policy lab that I work with are looking at that actually. And what they're looking at is, it's hard to trace everything that groups are doing over time in a nice quantitative fashion. But what they've been able to do is take statements that they make about the environment, and they actually trace like who's using what statements and like how are these statements spreading. And what they find is that when certain investment institutions, when large banks start talking about climate one way, then other banks will start adopting that language too, right? And if they're framing it as this kind of problem or that kind of problem or a divestment issue or what have you, that those kind of moral injunctives and normative type statements are spreading across these kind of networks.
Really interesting.
Yeah, so there does seem to be, I would say that you see this kind of social influence at many, many levels, both individual, institution, even government. As that one anecdote, I was going around and promoting this this like app I'd helped develop at one point. I was at Stanford. Forgive me for helping develop an app. I wasn't
we
really
still
doing
like
the
you,
developing.
Greg. We still like you.
I wasn't doing the developing part. I was just helping advise on it. But I was brought in because I had brought a lot of social science to the app, and I would explain like, oh yeah, we give people norm information because people conform when they learn that other people are doing things, and we use this dynamic norm information because it seems to work even better, even when things aren't the norm yet. And I'd given that pitch, and at the end, a lot of times city officials who were thinking about distributing this for free would go, "That's really interesting. Do other cities do this too?" And I thought it was funny because I was like, I just got done explaining to you that norms like influence people. And I was like, you know, and we've been going around from city to city and be like, more and more cities are starting to do this. It's true. And so it was just really funny to me that like, even in that context where I just explained to them how norms work, that they would ask me about the participation of other peers. So I think that
that's wonderful.
Happens.
That's actually a wonderful story.
I think this happens at a lot of levels.
Yeah, and Kayla Reeves, hi Greg, awesome talk, thanks. Heard a lot about building norms and supportive actions and the importance of positivity and the carrot. I wonder if you could briefly talk about eroding norms that support undesirable behavior. Can we think of a shame-free approach to eroding negative norms without building positive new ones?
That's a good question. There's one project that I'm starting a collaboration with and looking at a similar type of question, which is, okay, I've shown that when things are starting to take off, that people observing that change will like accelerate it. right? But like, what do you want to do if you want to like deflate a dynamic norm? Like, you don't want this behavior to take off. And so a lot of people might look at unsustainable development paths in developing countries as an example, where they're like, I don't know if I want everyone to have really inefficient air conditioners or something like that, like all over the world. Like, they're worried about like the lifestyles that people turn into norms in these contexts are going to have a huge impact on the climate change. And like, what do we do about that? Like, is there something we can do? And so I collaborate with partners who are in those regions and asking those questions. And there's a few solutions that we're starting to do research on now. Some of them involve trying to point out inconsistencies between those changes and existing values. So to an extent, this is still, I think, kind of shame-y, but they're in contexts where these things haven't taken off yet exactly, right? So they're not like most people. And so it seems like a more viable option. There's also ways of just saying you can divert attention, presumably, away from this norm's taking off and instead to this alternative to that is also taking off. So like, if you are in the context of people buying air conditioners in India, you might want to say, for instance, that there's a very large growth in like a sort of Energy Star equivalent, right? Like more efficient versions of these things, or people are using more space efficient versions of them, right? You want to like highlight the positive version and have that kind of win the sort of salience battle in people's minds for which norms they see and therefore which ones they're more likely to conform to.
I'm really curious about these different cultural contexts. I appreciate that, you know, every high school kid in Denmark went out to the climate demonstrations. It was like the de facto place you had to be. And that a lot of my European colleagues, you know, no one goes to conferences except by train because of the social shaming associated with flying. And so depending on where you are, depending, I'm sure, as well on the individualist versus collectivist kind of nature of our societies, some of these tools may work a little bit differently. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand some of those trade-offs and contours and just how that context and that cultural norming and the adherence to it kind of can affect some of the applications of these different approaches.
Gladly. So the work I presented was, double checking, I think all of it, except for one of the smaller studies I referenced, was done in the United States. The one on disposable cups was not done in the US. It was just done in Western Europe, I think. But I think all the other ones are US-based studies. and there's research showing like where do these approaches work better or worse and how are they different? And by and large, social influence as a mechanism tends to work, if anything, not as well in what are called independent cultural contexts like the United States and Western Europe. And they tend to work better in what are sometimes referred to as interdependent cultural contexts, such as East and South Asia. And the rest of the world is not quite as independent as US, Western Europe, and Australia. So if anything, these could be thought of as like lower bounds for some of these effects. I think the dynamic norms work slightly differently, though, in these contexts. Like when something's taking off, that could be perceived two ways. It could either be like, oh, those people are deviants, right? Because everyone really loves the norm, right? In these kind of contexts where there's greater adherence, there's tighter restrictions on how people behave. It could be seen as deviance, or it could be seen as that's the way we're all heading, right? And so there must be this kind of social, cultural sanctioning process that determines which it is. And so figuring out what those factors are is going to be really important. And we're thinking about like, oh, so if a bad norm's taking off, you want it to be seen as deviance, not the way we're all going. And like, how do you leverage those factors to make it one or the other?
Oh, this was absolutely fantastic. I wanted to give you a few minutes at the end to wrap up kind of your big thoughts, where you're taking your research in the future, and just leave us with kind of a capstone of what you think is really important.
Great. So I think the concluding slides do a good job of wrapping up what I hope people take away from this work. I'll just kind of give a few teasers about a couple things coming up, though, maybe for the last minute. So one of them is looking at people's different climate narratives. So we kind of expanded on some of that work in the Spillover study, seeing like, how do people think climate change is going to be resolved? And we're going to examine the differences between the public's perception on those answers. Like, is it behavior? Is it policy? Is it behavior and policy? Is it a kind of new technologies will save us? Like, there's all these different kind of narratives. Like, wealthy philanthropists need to be the ones making these changes, right? There's like kind of we made about 20 of them, I think. So we're asking the public that, we're asking a decision maker sample that. We want to see if decision makers do or don't share the same narratives about how to solve climate change. And then we're seeing if people perceive the American public the way it really is. Like, does the American public know what the average American thinks about this kind of issue, or are they off? And do decision makers know how the American public feels, or are they off? So that's one line of research we're looking at.
You should make sure that you're surveying the researchers too, because oftentimes we're defining our questions based on our understandings of the world. And if we're off, then we're all asking the wrong questions too.
It's true, we could. Sometimes it's tough to get researcher samples.
Yeah.
But well, yeah, that could be a fun extension. You might see something on an email list. And then so that's one project that I want to mention because I think there's different takes on this, right? And they kind of have a range of being more or less technocratic, or more or less incrementalist, or more or less. There's a lot of ways to analyze these questions and ask those things. Another line of work is trying to get more out of social influence. So I think we're just skimming the surface on what we can do for social influence right now. And the reason I say that is because right now everyone's using what I will call a 1 or 2 norm approach, where if you want somebody to ride a bike, you say most people ride a bike, or you say most people care about riding a bike or support it or something like that. But really, every norm that's out there exists in connection to like a dozen or more norms that it's related to. Like, people do similar behaviors to that. Do they generally subscribe to the broader values that seems to be a part of? Do they think it's similar to valued identities that they have? There's like a dozen or probably more.
Do they live in environments where they can ride a bike and not get killed?
Right. So all these things don't just have like a personal opinion about them, but like a norm perception about them too.
Absolutely. Yep.
And those things kind of coalesce to be, do I think other people care about the environment? Do I think other people like physical exercise? Do I think other people, right? This long list of all things that relate to, let's say, bike riding. And then you can kind of say like, oh, so if I wanted to use social influence effectively, would I just mention one thing that people feel? It's like, no, you should really try to paint like a broader picture, like a narrative, using many norms that all are very important to that person regarding that behavior. And so before, we've just been kind of skimming the surface by picking one norm that we wanted to target, when instead we should probably be making narratives out of these like norm clusters that all matter. And then you're not necessarily just trying to utilize one norm, you're trying to utilize like a social reality that somebody is kind of existing in. Right?
Yeah.
And I think at that level, the use of social influence should be a much more effective tool. And we haven't done it yet. So that's new. And I'm excited to see what it brings. And we're looking at that right now in the context of offshore wind support in the Northeast, which seems like an important domain to maintain support, as they're going to start trying to cite things and neighborhoods are going to be like, oh, wait, I'm going to have to look at this. Like, you're going to have to, that's going to be an issue, and we want to head it off in some way. So.
Now, this is all really interesting work, and I want to thank you so much for coming and being part of this series. And I look forward to seeing the results of this new work come up too. So take care and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.